Sarah Kriegler is a Melbourne-based writer-director and one half of Lemony S Puppet Theatre.
We always ask ourselves, is a puppet the best tool for telling this story? And if not, what's a better tool?
Join Sarah and I as we discuss writing theatre in a contemporary arts landscape and new opportunities with the Lemony S Puppet Lab.
We have to have diversity across the arts and also in puppetry.
Join Sarah and I now, here on Talking Sock. Welcome to Talking Sock, your place for puppetry arts and practitioners in Australia and abroad. My name is Pete Davidson, and this is our second episode of Season 2 with my guest and lately mentor, Sarah Kriegler from Lemony S Puppet Theatre. We are recording today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sarah, thank you so much for recording with us today in your child's studio.
That's right.
Such a cool little space.
Pleasure. Thanks for asking me, Pete. Yes, we are in my daughter's bedroom. We tried to do it in the studio out the back, but there was a very loud bird and a lot of wind. So here we are in Ada's bedroom.
Doing a live one. It's nice to be out of lockdown and not be doing the Zoomies. It's nice to have a fresh face in the room and, actually vibe off someone's energy, which is really nice too. Yeah. So, Sarah, every person I speak with has to have this question first. You ready for it?
Yeah, go on.
Why puppets?
You start with the curly ones first, don't you, Pete? Why puppets? It's a good question, Pete, especially when you're doing a podcast about puppetry. Well, this is how me and Jacob describe it, and, not to speak for him, but I have spent a lot of time with him over the last 17 years. So I do know how he feels about this, and it's very similar to how I feel about it. So what we often say is that we use puppetry as a storytelling tool. So for us in our work, we only use puppets when puppets are the best tool for the job. And what I mean by that is that, and no disrespect to anybody who does anything differently, because this is just my artistic aesthetic. So different to what some other puppet companies and puppeteers might do is that they will put the puppet at the front, as in the front of the work, so they have got an interest in making a puppet work. What we've got an interest in doing is making a piece of theatre, and always what comes first is the content. So we always ask ourselves first, well, is a puppet the best tool for telling this story? And if not, what's a better tool? That's probably the answer. And it just so happens that the stories that we want to tell need puppetry in it to be able to do that story justice. And, I think we're going to talk a little bit about our children's work, Picasso and his dog, in a little while. That's a perfect example of why puppets. So I was trying to tell the story of Pablo Picasso and a love affair that he had with a dog in the last part of his life. And the only way to tell that story is to use a puppet dog. But we used an actor to play Picasso because the nuance of the performance that character needed couldn't be done by a puppet. I mean, maybe it could, but actually it wouldn't be as good. We are always asking ourselves the questions, well, what's the best tool for telling this story?
Can you remember when you first sort of figured out that you wanted to study puppetry or even discovered your first puppet?
So after high school, I went and I did a Bachelor of Arts majoring in drama studies at La Trobe Uni. And as part of that, we used to go and see shows and have to write a review as part of our assessment. And one of the shows we went to see was Ask the Captain by Asman Visual Theatre. And that was a retelling of the T.S. Eliot poem. I think it might have been The Wastelands. I can't remember. So I went and saw that show, and I was really impressed with the way that story was told. I can't actually remember that much about it. I can remember the fulcrum and some kind of puppet on the fulcrum, and it was like, oh, isn't that amazing? And I suppose my interest started there, but my professional interest started at that point. But when I think about it, it actually goes back much earlier. The very first show I remember seeing as a kid was actually a polyglot puppet theatre show. and I have the smallest of small memories. I actually remember the building more than I remember the show. I remember the little white building and something going on the stage, and I know it was a polyglot piece, but I can't remember how I know that. I think my mum told me that maybe. But then also I have always been interested in story and objects. My dad, who was a cancer research scientist but a very imaginative man, he and I used to have this great thing that we used to do every night, which was my dad made the teddies talk.
Oh.
So, and he developed all these mad characters with the bears and things. So we used to just, I don't know how I ever got to sleep actually, because we were screaming with laughter over this teddy talking nonsense that we used to do all the time. So really, I suppose my understanding of how useful it is in telling stories started long ago, probably with my dad, and then was reinforced along the way on the journey of becoming a professional artist, I suppose.
That's gorgeous. Was it sort of improv object theatre with the teddies, or was it a through line every night you picked off from when you left off?
There was not a through line, but the characters were the same. Like, one character, for example, had a Mickey Mouse teddy, and he had these big yellow shoes or big yellow feet.
Yeah.
So he was like quite vicious. He used to kick everybody. But I used to think that was hilarious. Mickey would kick everyone. Teddy was much more gentle. My mum's bear was involved as well. She's got this ancient old bear called Stick Eye, and he was involved in as well. So yeah, so not a through line, but the characters were the same.
That's gorgeous. So Lemony S Puppet Theatre,
yes,
emerged as a creative partnership between yourself and your partner Jacob. Can you tell us the story about how that emerged and how perhaps you started with puppetry and then that led to Lemony S?
It's quite a long story, probably, with lots of different threads that came together, but I'll do my best to be succinct. So, it's a long time ago now, 2002 maybe. I was invited to be part of a show called A Quarrelling Pair, which was produced by Aphids. They're still around. They're kind of like a multidisciplinary art group. They do all kinds of stuff. They're amazing. And they had found a puppet play by a woman called Jane Bowles. So she was a bohemian writer in the late 1950s, late 1940s in New York. And she was a playwright and a poet, and she'd written this weird puppet play. They had found this play, and it had only ever been performed once before, which was when it was originally written. And they had an interest in developing this work. So they took this play, it was called A Quarrelling Pair, and they gave it to two contemporary Australian writers. Lally Katz is one of them, and the other one was Cynthia Troop. And they asked them to write a companion piece for these works. So each work was 3 different shows. Each of them was 10 minutes or 15 minutes long. They were about 2 sisters, a quarrel, and a glass of milk. So that was a through line between all 3 of them. So this was this sort of mad show that we did, and we did it first in the Melbourne Festival 20 million years ago. Then, weirdly, I went to my cousin's wedding. And at my cousin's wedding, I met Stephen Armstrong, who was, at the time, the company manager at Malthouse Theatre. And he also previously had been part of Handstand Visual Theatre.
There you go.
So he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I make puppetry and blah, blah, blah." And he was like, "Oh, that sounds interesting. And what are you working on?" And I told him about this work, Quarrelling Pair. And he said, "Well, actually, we've got this little theatre that we're going to open called the Tower Room up in the gods of Malthouse. And we're looking for interesting work, so you should come and talk to me about it." Around about the same time, I had been on tour with Black Hole Theatre on their show Caravan around Europe. And I had met Jacob at this time. And we, started a relationship. So he was auditioning for College of the Arts to go and do animateering. And he needed an audition piece. So we developed a little small puppet piece based on a song by the Tiger Lilies. And he got into VCA and did that course. At the same time, when I was talking to Stephen Armstrong about the Quarrelling Pair, Jacob and I were beginning to develop a new show together, which was called Apples and Ladders. It was an adult puppet piece. And because A Quarrelling Pair was quite a short work, Malthouse sort of said, well, what else have you got? Let's see if we can put some things together and make a fuller program. So that's how it happened. We developed Apples and Ladders as a sort of second half to A Quarrelling Pair. They were completely unrelated other than being adult puppet works. And I think that that is Aphids and what became Lemony S Puppet Theatre. I think we were the first show to ever go on in the Tower Room at the Malthouse, but we'd have to check that. But I think that is true.
Double bill.
Yes. So then we basically launched Lemony S Puppet Theatre without knowing we were launching a company that had any longevity in that season. We came up with a name based on a whole lot of stories about family dogs. My dad had a dog called Lemony, and he was from South Africa. He's still alive, so I shouldn't say he was from there, but he's lived here for a long time now. He used to go out into the paddocks with his dog Lemony and stare up at the stars and try and find Sputnik. So he was sort of stargazing in South Africa while my mother hadn't met at this stage. They were both quite young. She was in Gippsland staring up at the stars, also trying to find Sputnik with her dog. So it was kind of this story across stars and dogs and dreaming of what could be, which is where the name came from.
So, because that's gorgeous, but Lemony S so the dog's name from South Africa was Lemony.
Yep.
Where does the S come from?
Well, because the S stands for soars, so as in soars into the sky. But you see, if you say Lemony soars, it sounds dodgy. It sounds like you've got lemony festering sores. So we just removed that bit and left the S.
Does it get caught up with Lemony Snicket?
All the time.
But
we didn't even know that existed at the time.
No, it was before probably those books became
a thing.
But it's good to clear that up, I think, on the record, to know the origin of that name.
And it's sort of, the other thing is, I do think, I don't know if this is completely true, but I think the first dog in space was called Laika. And I'm pretty sure that the English translation of that is Lemony, which is why my dad called his dog Lemony.
Wow.
Yeah, so anyway, we have things that inspire us, and I think I shouldn't speak for Jacob, but certainly for myself, the connections between humans and animals is certainly a driver in our work. Not all the works, but certainly some of the seminal works. That's what there's been a sort of a through line there, which, makes sense of the name.
And for yourself, is there a real affinity with animals?
Yes, well, we've always had a dog. And in fact, the little logo on our symbol is our old boy, Clancy. He was an excellent hound. He died a few years back. And we put him in a show 3 weeks after we got him.
Goodness.
We did a show called the Shit Family Puppet Show, and Clancy was the performing dog. And he was really bad at it, but it didn't matter because it was called the Shit Family.
That's one way to really set the expectation for your audience.
Yeah, it was Shit. Shite. It wasn't actually our idea. It was Megan Cameron, who's puppeteer. She's not working as much in puppetry these days, but she was part of Handspan and Black Hole and all of those things years ago. So it was actually her idea, and we just went along for the ride because she had a drag king character called Jack Shit, and Jacob and I used to play the parents. So I was Mavis and he was Cyril. And it was bonkers. We did a lot of mad things with that troupe of people, including a show in the backyard for Fringe years ago. Oh, my God.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So I just want to quickly say 20 years odd later, maybe just under, where is Lemony S transformed to and come to from that origin point? How would you describe it as a company now?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, it's hard to, we haven't talked about art for so long because we've been in this crazy time.
It's true.
That I'm going to struggle to find the words, and also just the whole sense of hubris trying to explain your own work and where you think you sit in a patchwork of other companies, I find a bit hard to talk about. So I don't know, Pete. I mean, I would say we're just doing what we do. Jacob's got this thing where he always says, you're only as good as your last show. And that's how we work, in that we are always trying to do the next thing as good or better than we did the last thing, building on what we've learnt. I think we probably are at a point now where people know what we're doing, and I think we sit between, in a fairly unique place, perhaps, between theatre, puppetry, children's work, work for families, and also adult work. So I think we have a kind of fairly unique little space there. I hope we offer things to our community as well as the audiences. I think we do through the Puppet Festival and things like that.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You're not only performing and making work, but you're facilitating spaces for other people to bring their work. And it's funny because I was just about to ask about the 2020 Festival of Puppetry, which you managed to produce in probably one of the most volatile landscapes for performing arts in the last 100 years, if we really think about it. How did you pull it off? And also, what does it take to run a festival of puppetry in Australia and in Melbourne?
Well, I'm going to answer the second part first.
Okay.
Because actually what it takes is collaboration and partnerships. Because we do the Puppet Festival with Lemony Theatre, and without them we really couldn't do it, because they're a funded company, so they have the infrastructure that we don't. So they can support us in a way that, we just couldn't do it without them. They've got the venues, they've got the ticketing system, they've got the audiences that come. Without that partnership and collaboration, we couldn't do it. For example, I know that Sue Wallace, worked really hard with one van and probably had similar things where there was the collaboration of the town, but really the collaboration with the theatre is key to its success. And then how do we do the 2020? Well, look, it was really a fluke. That is the truth of the matter. Of course, we've got skills, but if you'll remember, we came out of lockdown 5 for 2 weeks.
We sure did.
And then we went back into lockdown. And it's by some miracle, it was in those 2 weeks.
That tiny window.
Yeah. So it was actually extraordinary. So Hayley Fox, who is the production manager at Lemony, she and I were working on it really since 2019. We were planning and rescheduling and reorganising everything, and we really didn't think we were going to do it. We just kept saying to each other, let's just plan as if we're doing it. Let's just book that thing because we might do it. We just kept doing it like that until it got to the weekend before, and we're like, oh, hang on, we're actually going to have to do the festival now. Well, lucky we did those things, like book people's accommodation and so on. But the 2020 festival was actually meant to be on in 2019.
Yes.
But in 2018, Little Lemony Theatre burnt down.
It did.
Which was just horrific. Not horrific. Look, there's many worse things in the world than that. But it was a great loss for Melbourne, and it was pretty overwhelming because we don't live too far from Lemony. So I heard about it on the radio, and I said to Jacob, I think I need to go down. And I stood in the street with Caitlin, who's the one of the CEOs of Lemony, just like staring at the building burning to the ground. Like, it was really awful. And there was this group of people from all kinds of different artists just heard it on the radio and went down, and we just all stood there in the street and watched it burn, and it was mental.
Harrowing. Yeah, so,
and I think because we all knew, we've been involved with the Lemony for a very long time. The community, the arts community, had already gone through buying the theatre off the landlord who was going to sell it. If he sold it, it would have been developed into apartments or something. So we'd already raised millions of dollars to buy it, and then it burnt down, for God's sake. So anyway, the festival was meant to be on in 2019, but we postponed because it was too much pressure for Lemony to try and do anything when they were down one venue at that stage.
Well, I remember trying to launch One Orange Sock in early 2020, and that's when you were taking expressions of interest.
That's right, yes.
And so I was like, I just started, I haven't got a show yet. And I was so upset with myself for not putting anything in. And then I ended up being in it anyway. So
well, that's right. So that's what happened. It was meant to be 2019. We postponed it because of the fire to 2020. We had it all planned out and organised for 2020.
And the fire was sort of an omen of what was going to happen to theatre in the 2020.
And then, of course, COVID happened, and we rescheduled it to September 2020.
Yep.
But we were still in lockdown down here in Melbourne.
That was number 2.
So we just rolled it over to 2021. We lost a lot of artists, of course, because people from Western Australia felt really worried about coming, which is fair enough because the borders have been so strict between Western Australia and the rest of the country.
Yeah.
We had this amazing company coming from Indonesia, Paper Moon Puppets, and they were kind of our headlining show.
For sure.
And of course they couldn't come. So anyway, we decided to focus on the East Coast artists and just keep doing it in case we might, keep planning, keep booking things, keep organising things in case we might get to do it. And by some miracle, we did.
It did, and it did happen, and I think it was so necessary that it happened at the time that it did, especially because, when you're literally diving in and out of lockdown. That's right, folks. We did 6 lockdowns in Melbourne over the course of 2 years, and there may be a 7th. We're not sure yet. So there is these little gaps and these little waves of time that we get a chance to perform and get out there and do the work. And so what was the reaction from the festival? How was it received, and how did you feel after that huge amount of time and effort? What was the catharsis? Was there catharsis? Was there that yield?
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, I think myself and Hayley, was so tired by the time we opened that we didn't realise we were going to enjoy ourselves. And when it started and, get all these families coming in to experience art together, it was really quite overwhelming. And it wasn't the greatest version of the festival that we could have done, but we did our best in the situation that we were in with the very small audience capacity because of the capacity limits that the government had put on venues. And just all the things. We don't need to go into it. We all have lived through what the things have been in the last 2 years. But I think it was amazing. And I remember at one point Jacob saying, because I was saying, we're never doing this again, we're never doing this again. And once the festival was out, Jacob just went, yeah, but we will, because it's really good. And look how much fun everyone's having. Look at the variety of work that is able to be put on in just an amazing short amount of time. I mean, not that everyone's working on it for years, we understand that. But what I mean is, like, within the 7 days, you could see a huge array of different types of work.
In this tiny space, between 2 blocks in Carlton, basically.
Yeah.
That you could walk around and see roving puppets, and then jump into a gallery space and watch a show, and then jump out the back courtyard to see another show, and then jump to the theatre and see that. It was special. I think it's really worth acknowledging how much it gave us hope that the area is going to come back and has come back.
Yeah.
One of the shows in the festival was your show Picasso and His Dog, which I think has been quite it's quite a mammoth show. It's a big show for that little space in the Mama. Can you tell us about that show and how it came together? It was a beautiful story about Pablo Picasso and his pet. And I think it was one of those lovely emergences of puppetry as a tool in theatre that you explained earlier. So can you tell us a bit more about that and how did it come about and where did you get the concept?
Yeah, sure. That show had a very, very long gestation. More than 10 years ago, there was a photographic essay printed in The Age by a man called David Douglas Duncan. I know he's got
what a name.
3 first names.
Yes.
Crazy. Anyway, he was a photographer. He's still alive, actually. He's an American photographer, and he was friends with all kinds of artists, and Pablo Picasso was one of them. So in the late 1950s, he went down to the south of France and took photos of Picasso in his studio. And at the time, David Douglas Duncan had a dachshund pup and called Lump. And Lump actually means rascal in German. Anyway, Lump. So this little dog. And the pup was being terrorised by one of his other dogs who was, I don't know what sort of dog that was, but the pup and the big dog weren't getting on well. So he took this pup with him to Picasso's studio in the south of France. And Picasso had dogs his whole life. But up until this point, they had just been things that were around in his life. But he wasn't really a dog man. He just had them, you know. And this guy, David Douglas, arrived. I've forgotten his name now.
Just David.
David.
Just
Let's
David.
say David. So David arrived to do this photographic session with the pup. He put the pup down on the ground, and Picasso looked at this dog and fell head over heels in love with him.
Mm.
About 10 years ago, the photographs of this dog at Picasso's house were published in The Age. And I kind of looked at those pictures and thought, wow, what a beautiful story. And then I left it for years, like 6 years or something. Maybe even longer. I can't even remember. Look, time is weird at the moment. Let's just say in the distant past I saw the pictures. I left it for about 5 or 6 years. But I kept having this, every now and again, those pictures would surface in my mind. And then eventually I thought, I'm going to get that actual book that those pictures were advertising. I'd cut them out of the paper at the time. And I went and bought the book, and then from there I developed the story. But, of course, the story, look, to be honest with you, I don't really like Picasso's work all that much. I don't like his paintings. He was a bit of a dodgy guy.
Yeah.
You know, he had very dubious relationships with women. But I used it as a frame to investigate the human-animal relationship and how we have coexisted with dogs for something like 30,000 years. And when you go into the research around the human-dog relationship, it's so deep and so complex. There's a whole scientific school of thought that believes that we are the modern humans because we actually domesticated dogs.
Right.
That they kept us safe. That at our ancient camps they cleaned up all the rubbish so that we didn't get sick. All of these kind of amazing interconnected things about humans and dogs means that they live in our lives and we live in their lives. So I really used the story as a catalyst to investigate that relationship between dogs and humans, but also dogs, humans, and art, because humans have been drawing pictures of animals and making sculptures of animals since the dawning of time. Since we realised we could actually make art, we've been making it of the creatures around us. So I was also trying to talk about how we think that we are above the natural world, but actually we're interconnected.
Mm.
So anyway, what was the question?
Tell us about the show. And I guess, here we go. So there's a couple of devices that I thought were really interesting in the show. The first was the voiceover of using your children to create sort of a through line of facts of puppies and things that happen, and the script was sort of almost just aligned itself and dropped in itself. And I think it was also a connection to the children who was your audience. That was one. The other was that you used several forms of puppetry in it. So there was a bit of shadow, there was the main dog, and who was being handled at any time by one of Picasso's art assistants. Mm. I was really curious as to how you decided on the tools of puppetry that you explain you use. How did you figure out the form for each of those different moments? But also, why using your children as the voiceovers, and what was that designed to do?
Yep. Well, the voiceovers came about because, did you notice the other voiceover of the woman's voice that was in that work as well? There was like, this one was working.
Yes.
Right. So that voiceover is text from Gertrude Stein, and she wrote this crazy essay about Picasso, watching him work and then reflecting and writing about Picasso working, because they were really good mates back in France. The original idea was, because when I was working with a dramaturg called Margaret Cameron, who is a very, very dear friend of mine, like my art mother, who sadly died about 6 years ago now, but she was integral to the creation of Picasso and his dog. So she had found that text from Gertrude Stein, and we had this idea. I think it was my idea. She was actually correct in the end. I said, this sounds like we should get children to read this. And she said, I disagree. I said, well, I'm still going to try it. Mm-hmm. So that's what I tried. I got my kids and another kid to read out the Gertrude Stein text, and we recorded them doing it. And it was terrible because it's such strange text. You need to be a performer to be able to understand what she's actually doing with that text. And the kids obviously weren't old enough to be able to access that kind of level of depth. But what was really amazing was in between the takes, they were chatting and they were talking about things. And I went, that's what we need. So then we went down to the sound designer's studio and I showed the kids videos of different things, of artists working, and I just got them to describe what they were seeing. So that was the first layer, is like the kids in the story describe what they're seeing in terms of the art. So Picasso is drawing a straight line and some kid says, now he's drawing a line. I wonder what he's going to do with that. And that was all very improvised. So I just showed them things and they answered it, and then I found the place in the performance for that to sit. And then the second layer of that was my daughter Ada, who was also quite into animals. I got her to read out dog facts. So as if she was reading a book about humans and dogs. So that's how the kids' voices work in the show. And you're right, it is actually about the audience. It's about two things, actually. It's about the information of the dogs, but it's also what's so great about children's theatre is, and well, actually not so much children's theatre, but work for families, because I love an audience that's mixed between adults and kids. But what I really love is when the kids are talking to their parents or their adult that they're with, that they're saying, what's going on? And then the parents saying, oh, well, this is happening as well. So it's actually like a three-way conversation between the art on stage, the adult, the kid, and then back to the art. And I just love that. And I wanted to encourage the kids in the audience to be asking questions and feel free to say things and to chat to Picasso if they wanted to, or chat to their mum if they wanted to. So that's what that other layer of the kids' voices is doing. It's giving the audience, the children in the audience, permission to make a bit of noise and ask questions.
And so you're creating all those little aha moments. You're creating that, and you're watching that manifest. And is that why there's another show that you've done recently, Charlie and the War Against the Grannies, at the Art Centre in Melbourne, where access was a real sort of feature, and there were several performances that were relaxed, some with Auslan interpreters, some of the lights on. Is that so that you can manifest those art? Obviously, they're to include and keep lots of different kinds of audiences, allow them access to that space. But is that what you were trying to manifest as well, in those little aha moments and those spaces for the conversation between adults to take place?
Do you mean in Charlie or in Picasso?
In both, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yes, that is exactly what we're trying to do. There's nothing worse, I think, than children being told to be quiet in the theatre. Like, that drives me insane. I mean, I did a lot of schools touring years ago, and teachers ripping shreds off kids for them being noisy in the performance. When we, as the performers, had stirred them up to the point where they were all screaming, that's what we want. We don't want them to be sitting like polite stunned mullets. We want them to be moving and engaged and loving it and squirming. And, that's what you do as a kid, and you should be given permission to do that. In terms of the Charlie work and the relaxed performances and things that you're talking about, that was actually from the Art Centre. They really want to open the doors to everybody. So they have a whole lot of different access programs, including cheap tickets for kids who don't normally get to go to the theatre, the relaxed performances, so for kids who might be sensitive to too much stimulation, that's when they leave on the lights and we lower the sound and all of that stuff. We have the breakout room. And they also published this amazing visual documentation of the work.
Yes, that was fantastic.
Yeah, it's really beautiful, so that you can see and know what's coming, so that the kids can come in and be prepared for any loud noises and things like that. So that's coming from the Art Centre. But, we wholeheartedly endorse that, and we're more than thrilled to be part of it.
For sure. So back to devices and the different kinds of puppetry that let's include Charlie now, because I think both works, include a range of puppetry, and, there's Jacob's Cranky, and there's the Shadows, and there's puppets on sticks, and there's puppets in wheelchairs. I'm really curious about how you look at a text and see a script and then go, that suits this device, that suits this device.
I would say they're not really looking at the script and working out the device. The two things are completely linked. So, for example, when I was writing Picasso, because I come from a puppetry background, I really knew I mean, I know Ronnie Burkett says work it out on the floor, but I'm actually working it out on the page.
Nice.
So I'm actually thinking, okay, how many pairs of hands have I got? And then is it possible to have this person doing this while the other person's doing that? Like I'm actually kind of designing and planning while I'm writing. And then, of course, that then leads into a conversation with the designers and the puppet makers about what I've written and how I think it could work. So the dog, for example, in Picasso and his dog, I was really clear that it had to be as close to a real dog as possible. I wanted the two puppeteers to double up as studio assistants, because that's another thing that Jacob and I are really interested in, is what's the relationship between the live performer and the puppet. And I'm not a big fan of just having a puppeteer on stage and a puppet. I'm really interested in investigating what's the relationship there, and then what does that relationship do to an audience member. So in Picasso, I made them to be studio assistants so that they could be involved in the action of the studio as humans, but then also as puppeteers. And then that sort of deepens the whole story in some ways too, because you've got these two characters that are playing with Picasso and enhancing the things he does, and then he's complimenting them on their work. And, you know, so it's kind of like it deepens the story. But if you're thinking about that relationship between puppet and puppeteer, because we tend not to hide the puppeteers in our work. Sometimes we do, but most of the time we're investigating what that relationship is. So the dog, we knew it had to be able to be picked up really easily so that the puppeteer could go from puppeteer to studio assistant, patting the dog rather than manipulating the dog. And that, of course, affects the way it's designed. So in that show, we worked with Jonathan Oxlade as the designer. What he picked up on, I suppose, was the playfulness of the story. And so he was like, well, I'd like this dog to be kind of real and kind of like a toy all at once. So that's why he's designed the way he is. In Charlie, you mentioned the granny who's in a wheelchair, and that's another solve on the page, because we knew how many actors we had. We had 3 actors and a lot to do, because it's a really dense book that was adapted from, called Charlie and the War Against the Grannies by Alan Breaux. So I needed to create a granny puppet that basically could be operated without being operated. So she was put into a wheelchair. And that was something that we worked out in the creative development, which was about 12 months, take out that COVID year, but 12 months before it was meant to preview, we had a creative development where we solved those kind of things. So we had the designer in the room, Adi Chisholm, and Adi's done quite a lot of puppetry in the past as well, and myself. So the two of us were kind of driving how the puppetry might work, because everyone else was actors or singers.
What does it take to build a show like Charlie or Picasso, his dog?
Well, they're actually pretty different shows in a way, because Picasso was our work, so it was like an independent event. No, not event, what do I mean? An independent theatre company. So we had to raise all the money ourselves. I did that. We wrote a million grants, got the money. And then it took almost 2 years to get the premiere season of the show. We premiered it in 2017, and then it took another 12 months to a year of taking it around to all the arts markets and presenting it for us to get the big tour in 2019. So it took a long time for that to kind of eventuate, because we had to do it all ourselves. Charlie was really, really different. Alan Breaux and myself were match made by the Art Centre. We'd actually met many years ago on other things, but we have a mutual friend, Amor Harrington, who was originally the programmer of Children's and Families at the Art Centre. And Alan had said to her, I really want to adapt this for the stage. And she said, oh, well, you should talk to Sarah Kriegler about that, because I think the two of you could work well together, and she knows about making children's theatre. So we got match made. I think they gave us $10,000 to do a creative development, which was where we tested out the relationship and worked out whether we could work together. And Alan wrote a few songs. We worked out a few stylistic things about the puppetry. We brought in an actor and a musician to kind of have a little muck about. And then from there, I mean, this never happens, Pete. This never happens, right? But the art centre was invested in some big show that fell over. And so they had a pot of money that they needed to put somewhere. And they came to Alan and me and said, so you know that show you're working on, do you reckon you could have it ready by blah, blah? We want to commission it. And we're like, oh, okay. And then they just gave us a huge amount of money to make the show.
Great.
It was crazy. And then we got match made with some producers, which was CDP up in Sydney. So they kind of helped us get it up. But that never happens, Pete. It never happens. So it'll never happen again, and we couldn't believe that it happened the first time. But it did, and that was really an amazing experience. Picasso really took, I'd say, 4 or 5 years of slow and steady work to get it to where, you know, to the premiere season. Many, many grant applications, you know, lots of unpaid hours, all of that stuff, whereas Charlie was completely different.
You are listening to Talking Sock with One Orange Sock and Sarah Kriegler. We'll be right back after the break. Make sure you hit subscribe and follow at One Orange Sock Productions on Instagram. More with Sarah in just a second. Want to start a conversation at your next gig or festival? Then grab your wallets because we've got merch. Head to our Redbubble store to get your hands on some signature One Orange Sock designs. We believe that podcasts should be advert-free. So if you like what you're listening to, there's a new way to help support our podcast. No monthly subscriptions, just a simple tip to share your kindness and to help us get by. Follow the link in the podcast notes or at oneorangesock.com to buy us a coffee. Thanks for your support and thanks for listening to Talking Sock. Welcome back. You are listening to Talking Sock with me, Pete Davidson, and Sarah Kriegler. Sarah, recently we actually met formally because I was doing a residency with Regional Arts Victoria and you became my mentor.
Wasn't I just so mentorish?
So mentory. It was the best little half-hour Zoom call. I got a little allocated time with you once a week. And this is obviously coming from Regional Arts Victoria's grant from Creative Victoria and the government to make creative workers have spaces in schools, and my practice as a puppetry artist became one of those selections. And I want to ask you, what was it like being in the role of mentor to several young or emerging or even experienced artists? And how did you find yourself as someone who was seeing all these different things happen in different places and schools?
I really enjoyed it, and it was really great to have a part-time job for whatever it was, 6 months. That was like really helpful in pandemic world. I mean, I don't know about you, Pete, but like I've been doing this a long time, but I still suffer from do I actually know anything syndrome. Like I really do suffer from that. And so it was great to actually be useful to people and go, oh, actually I do know some things that could be useful because I have done quite a lot over the years. I thought it was a great program. I'm really sad that COVID, you know, stuffed it as much as it did, because I know that Regional Arts Victoria was very considered in the schools that they were going into with the artists, and a lot of those schools don't get that kind of stuff normally, so that was such a shame. But here's hoping some department somewhere will find the money again, and those kids will get an opportunity to actually have the artists in the room. So for those of you who don't know the program, what happened was that COVID shut schools down again. So a lot of the outcomes were delivered either early or online.
Or very late in my case.
Yeah.
Still being delivered.
Yeah, so that was disappointing, but understandable. I mean, we are in a global pandemic. As much as we want to think we're not, we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I really enjoyed that role, and I've met some excellent artists, yourself being one of them.
Stop.
And no, it's really great. It's great. I love, you know, I never want to be the kind of artist who's only working with certain people, even though there's a lot of value in that because it becomes so easy to do. You know, I really love meeting new artists and looking at what they're doing and finding ways that we could do something together. It's cool.
Well, just as well, because the reason I ask, about yourself as mentor is because you're about to start a training program with the Puppet Lab next year from March to December, one night a week for puppeteers to come together and work towards an outcome in puppetry. What is your vision for this program, and the fact that it's free for artists to be on board? It's kind of unprecedented for something like that to happen in Australia. And obviously, me and my background, how excited I am by the opportunity of something that could potentially educate me in this art form more. I'm just so excited to hear about your vision and what your plans are for it.
Yes, our plans. No, we do have plans. I should just give a little bit of background on it. So it's kind of based on the St. Anne's Warehouse Puppet Lab in New York, which we had the opportunity to see a bunch of the kind of graduating pieces while we were living in New York between 2018 and 2019. But, of course, we're going to tailor it to what we need here. It's come about for a number of reasons. Firstly, that there is no other training opportunities, long-term training opportunities in Australia anymore. When I started, there was none, which is why I ended up going to Argentina and studying there. And then, obviously, there was the VCA course for a while, and that produced some amazing artists like Sam Rutledge and Tamara Roos and Hamish Fletcher. All of those guys came out of that program, though they'd all been doing puppetry before that, but that's where they really, I suppose, launched from. Since then, there hasn't really been any opportunity for people to learn in depth. And it's come about because every time we offer a workshop for adults, it books out in 10 seconds. Absolutely. And people keep saying, when can we do more? When can we do more? And Jacob felt, and we live in a multicultural country, and he and myself have always thought, well, it's very white. Puppetry is very white in Australia, sure. And which is also in some ways a bit baffling, considering that we're part of Asia and there's such a strong tradition of puppetry in Southeast Asia, and that isn't reflected in our puppetry community. You've
never thought of it like that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so one of the things about the lab is we were working with Multicultural Arts Victoria to try and redress that, in that we, it's like we have to have diversity across the arts and also in puppetry. It's important. It's really important that we are reflecting the community that we live in. So 20% of the places in the lab are reserved for culturally and linguistically diverse artists or creatives. So that's really important, and that's something that we definitely want to do. So that's not what St. Anne's do in New York, but that's something that we are really passionate about. So that's one of our visions, that we're training people who want to know stuff and also people who are culturally diverse. But really, in terms of what we're going to do in the lab, I think that will be really guided by the people who end up in it. Because, for example, you might get someone who's got loads of experience and they really just want some help in how do I take this show that I've made and get it into the Malthouse. I just pulled that out of my hat. I don't know if they've...
But I'm still interested in the question. How do I do that?
Yeah, so that person might be more interested in the kind of producing aspect of what we're going to be able to offer. Got a really awesome producer called Samantha Butterworth who's going to be doing some masterclasses in producing. But then you might get somebody who really wants to know about hand-to-rod puppets. So then we're going to okay, I think I'm looking at you, Pete, and thinking of all the things that you might want to do. And
I'm going to apply.
Yeah, great.
Plotting.
And I'm like, well, then we need to get an expert in hand and rod. But we have spoken to lots of people, like Philip Mitchell from WA and Sonny Tilders from Creature Technology, Sam Rutledge down in Tassie. There's all these industry leaders that are going to be there, part of it somehow, and we'll develop it together. So we do have 3 performance outcomes, and each one of those, I don't think I wrote that in the application information, but each one of those is a paid outcome as well. We're basically developing work together.
Yes.
To perform. Let's make a show.
Let's do it.
My idea is that we'll probably end up with 6 small shows, but there's also opportunity that it could be one big show. Who the hell knows? We don't know. We're just going to get all of these interested people and interesting people together in a room and start.
I mean, it's going to be a recipe for something fabulous, whatever happens, really, isn't it?
And one of the reasons we're able to do it for free, by the way, I just want to explain that, is last year we were given a grant by the Sydney Myer Fund that was completely open-ended. Right? They said, here's a stack of money and you can do what you want with it. And it took us about 12 months to work out what projects we wanted to do with that money, and the lab is definitely one of them, because what that Myer money will allow us to do is to pay the tutors and to pay for the room, and the stipend is coming from the City of Moreland. We're successful in application there, so that's where we can pay people a stipend to be part of it.
Wow.
And we don't want it to be a money-making thing. It's not about us making money. It's about knowledge and transfer and collaboration and expansion.
You're thinking about the educational opportunities that you had and that Jacob had. How are you going to take potentially I really want to hear about Argentina, and I'd love to know more about animateuring as a course when it existed. I'm curious as to the educational opportunities that you and Jacob have had and how you're going to lead those into this course potentially.
Again, it's going to depend on what people want, because I imagine there's going to be some people who are really experienced at making theatre and only want to be there because they want to be in a room with a bunch of people working towards something. There might be other people who are brand new at developing a theatre work. So I really do feel like we're going to tailor it depending on who's in the room. But certainly all of our opportunities and experiences will underpin that. So we both did the graduate diploma of animateuring at VCA at different times. Animateuring means artistic leader. So it's a French word that means artistic leader. But really it's about theatre making. So it's about learning to make a show from the beginning, where you've got a seed of an idea rather than a script. You might develop a script, but it's about the process from the first idea through to the performance. So theatre making is definitely going to be part of it. Writing for puppetry, I think, is going to be part of it as well, because I really do think that's a very different thing to writing a play.
Absolutely. I learned that very recently.
And then, how do you write puppetry descriptions so that somebody who isn't schooled in puppetry can understand what it might look like? That's also part of it. I've been trying to do that for years and it's really hard. And filming it is not necessarily the answer, because sometimes you've got to write it down and show it to someone before you can make it. And definitely the experiences that I had at the Teatro San Martin in Argentina. It's the Escuela de Títeres, which means puppet school. Isn't that a good word?
It's great. Whoa. Do it again.
Títeres. That means puppets. And titeritero is puppeteer male, and titeritera is puppeteer female.
So
there you go. So that course, you want to know about that course?
I do.
So I got a Churchill Fellowship to go, because at the time there was nowhere to learn puppetry in Australia. And after I finished at the College of the Arts Animateuring, I auditioned for a polyglot show and I got the job. And because I'd done puppetry a little bit before, I also came from a dance background, so I understood puppetry pretty quickly. And I did maybe 2 different shows with them over a couple of years. And this is when Polyglot was a puppet company, so they were primarily doing works for children that involved puppets. But I sort of was really aware that I didn't know very much, that I was kind of flying by the seat of my pants. And I thought, I really enjoy this form and I want to know more and I want to be better at it. But there wasn't really anywhere else. There wasn't anywhere in Australia to do that. So I applied for a Churchill Fellowship and I got that, which was some kind of miracle. But the guidelines of the Churchill is that it has to allow Australians access to knowledge that you can't get here in Australia. So going to somewhere else to learn about puppetry really fitted into their kind of remit. I have to explain also that what I'm going to tell you about this course is 20 years old. So I don't know if it's still running in this way because Argentina's been through hell and back a number of times since I left. So, they used to have money for the arts. I don't know if they still do. But the course was a 3-year course. The first year was concentrating on skills training. Actually, the first 2 years is concentrating on skills training. So it's like an introduction in the first year, and the second year you deepened that knowledge, and then the third year they made a work. Most of the year they were working on an independent project to create their own show, and the tutors were on call for them regardless of, depending on what they needed. So
Wow.
I joined them for the second year of that course. And we did classes in voice, manipulation, dramaturgy, puppet making, movement, and kind of theatre making.
In English?
No, in Spanish.
Wow.
But this was the other reason why I chose that course, because I wanted to learn a second language, and I didn't think learning Czech or learning Japanese it wouldn't be as, I had a little bit of French, so I sort of didn't feel like those other languages would be as easy to pick up in a short amount of time. So I chose the course in Argentina because I wanted to learn a second language. And it was a great way of learning a language because the tutor would say, the puppet walks, and he would be demonstrating it walking, and you'd be like, oh, there's the word for puppet and walks, and he's conjugated the verb in that way, and, so actually it was a great way to learn. But I have a really weird version of Spanish because I can talk about set design and the soul of the puppet and theatre making, but I don't know how to shop. Like I don't know the words for so many vegetables and fruits and things like that because I wasn't speaking in that way. I was speaking in art speak in a puppet school.
Wow.
So it's really quite twisted. It's
That's
pretty
unreal.
funny. Anyway.
You're not the only one who I've interviewed so far who has learned about puppetry from overseas through a Churchill scholarship or fellowship. I'm curious as to whether or not you encourage other people to go for those sorts of things, and if that still exists. Does Churchill still exist?
It still exists, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't had any involvement with it since I finished it, which was the year 2000, so that's like 21 years ago now, Pete. It definitely still exists, and I think the guidelines are still the same, that it's about gaining access to knowledge that you can't get here. If you want to learn it and you can't find whatever it is in your local neighbourhood, then step out of your neighbourhood and go and learn it for sure.
Mm.
Yeah.
Aside from the Puppet Lab that's happening next year, what else is on for Lemony S?
So the lab will be going for the whole year from February through to December. But confirmed is we're making a new work for children. It's a schools touring work called Crow Girl, and that's sounds like the theme again, but it's a story about connection with animals. No, but it's actually about friendship with animals and also humans, and grief, and a little bit about isolation. So that will be on in the middle of the year. So it's a really different work. It's a very small scale schools touring work, for community halls and schools. And the reason why we want to do that is because we kind of realised in the whole COVID thing that we need to diversify. We can't be only relying on the theatres to be open and programming because they weren't.
Mm.
And so we're like, we need something smaller that we can also do in the gaps, like you were talking about, we had those little gaps of lockdown. Well, we can't get Picasso up and ready without quite a bit of money and some time. So this is this is a smaller work, so we hope to be more responsive to kind of the situation that's continuing to unfold in the arts.
As it fluctuates between in and out. And I think school spaces is a really great space to be working with, because I think in those times those spaces really need to connect with the kind of themes that are happening around them. So if you mention that it has something to do with isolation, you're going to be actually addressing concerns that perhaps teachers aren't necessarily comfortable broaching with young audiences that theatre can in a much more successful way, I think.
Yeah. So the story of Crow Girl is about a kid who's lost her dad, and so her and her mum moved back to her grandmother's farm, and her way through the grief is that she starts feeding the crows that come to the garden, and over time the crows start leaving her gifts. And this actually happens with crows, quite common, that when people make friends with crows, they start to leave them gifts. So it becomes this exchange between the girl and the crow. And then through this relationship and this love that her and the crow have with each other, her human neighbour has been watching and steps over the fence, more or less, and they become a trio. So that's the story of Crow Girl. So it's quite a simple story, but I think it will be very beautiful. If we get all the funding, we'll be working with a composer called Kate Neal, who is composing a recorder quartet that will accompany the show.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that won't go on the schools bit. That will be recorded and played. But we might get an opportunity to do it live at some point with the quartet. Yeah, I think that will be stunning, and I hope we get the bucks because I think it will be just so beautiful. I mean, Kate's an amazing composer, but to have a recorder quartet, come on.
Well, I mean, you're going to be either the bane of every teacher's existence or you're going to be really...
But this is the thing, recorders, when they're actually played properly, are astounding instruments.
Oh, there you go.
So, and she's talking about, the big bass ones, and oh my God, it's so beautiful.
Oh, that could be really cool, actually.
Yeah, we're hopeful. It's not confirmed, but we're hopeful also to be collaborating with the Carlton community and La Mama next year to create a puppet parade that will go on in the Puppet Festival, most likely working with the kids from the flats down in the Parkville Carlton high-rise estate, building parade puppets. And, our plan is to kind of block off Lygon Street.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, and just dance with puppets up the street with all these kids. So that's a project that we're really hopeful about, but, we've got to find the bucks. The bucks are on their way, but not everything is confirmed yet. So Crow Girl, the Puppet Parade and the Lab, that's mostly next year. And then 2023, we're premiering a new work for family audiences. It's actually a main stage work, so it's the opposite of Crow Girl. It's quite large. It's got a cast of 4 performers. We've been working on that work throughout last year and this year and next year.
Wow.
And then it will be on in 2023. And it's got a lot of interest on various main stage. It's kind of similar to Picasso's, the scale of Picasso and his dog. It's that kind of bigger work.
And so is this forward planning, years ahead, a result of lockdown pushing everything back and thus you are looking a couple of years ahead, or is this just the way in which you work by having a plan for the next few years and seeing everything progress over a project-based kind of time frame?
Well, yes and no. Some of the things are just opportunities that arise. So Crow Girl, we got approached by the Maroondah Council Art Space to make a work with them. That's where it'll go on next year. So we didn't plan that. It just came about. But it was that I already had that story kind of brewing.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, well, what about this? And they were like, yeah, that's a great idea. And yeah, anyway, so that's how that came about. The other things, yes, we've planned ahead for them because we are employing people to work on those things with us. We need to find the money, and we do that by writing 20 million grants and being commissioned and things like that. So that takes a lot of time. The work, did I even tell you what the work in 2023 is
no.
called? Okay, it's called Ada, Asman and the Analytical Engine, right? We just call it Ada Asman. That's what and I know my daughter's name is Ada, but it's actually based on Ada Lovelace, not Ada Williams Kriegler.
Oh, wow.
So that story is about mathematics, and it's about girls in education and education opportunities for girls. And we investigate that story by imagining a world where a young girl called Asman, who's a newly arrived Turkish refugee to Australia, is struggling with online learning in the time of COVID. And through, I don't want to give away how, but through some magic of puppetry, I can't believe I said that phrase, but through some things that happen, she meets across time and space Ada Lovelace. And I don't know if you know about Ada Lovelace, but she is credited with being the world's first computer programmer 200 years before we had the technology to make the first computer. She was a really phenomenal mathematician, young woman. She died when she was 36, and she was extraordinary. Her mother was also extraordinary, I just have to add. Her mother was incredible. So in our story, Asman meets Ada, and they connect over numbers, they connect over philosophies, and they connect over what's similar and what's different about their world experiences.
I'm curious now, having heard about the story that you're planning and also hearing about Picasso and his dog and the other kind of stories that you tell, Crow Girl, for example, what are your favourite stories to tell, and how do you approach story when the idea is seeded?
I think what happens, and I'm talking about myself, I'm not necessarily talking about Lemony S's work, because sometimes the stories comes from someone else like Jacob or Tamara or whatever. But so the stuff that we've done that's my stories, it usually starts with a visual image. So I already spoke to you about Picasso, how I saw those photographs, and that's what sparked me thinking about dogs and humans and how it's interconnected and how we are who we are and how they are who they are because they've been with us for 30,000 years and so on. For example, did you know that dogs are one of the few animals that have eyebrows? And
yeah.
They've developed eyebrows because humans respond to eyebrow acting, as we call it. It's wild.
That's crazy.
That's co-evolution, So anyway, that's why you can't resist them when they look at you and they do the thing, and you have to give them some of the food. And it's like they have worked it out, right, over 30,000 years. So anyway, I digress. So it's about what sparks the story. So the Crow Girl story is another one like that. I saw a little article on a BBC website, and there was a story about this girl who had made friends with a crow, and she collected all the things that the crow had given her in a box. And it's just so cute, the things, like bits of string, and it looks like junk, right? But when you know, and so she's got a box of junk, right? But when you know a crow has given her that box of junk, it suddenly becomes treasure.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about that story. So anyway, that's what sparked the Crow Girl story. There are many, many girls around the world, and adults and boys and whoever, who have got relationships with crows that get, if you look it up, it's so cute. People write up what they've been given that day and stuff. It's so gorgeous. Anyway, so that's what sparked that story. The Ada Asman one was also my daughter, as you just pointed out, is also called Ada. So when she was little, she was given a book about Ada Lovelace, and it's called Ada Lovelace's Inventions. This little picture book. And at the time she was given the book was when we were starting Picasso. She was really little back then. I think she was grade 2 or 3 or something like that. She's now 13, but that's because it's been around a while, that show. She was reading the book with me, and she said, "This would make a good story, Mum. When you finish Picasso, you should make this story."
Oh, wow. It was her suggestion.
So it was her suggestion,
Wow.
the initial start of it. So that's where that idea started. But so I started looking into Ada Lovelace a bit, reading a little bit about her, and then what was really interesting to me about Ada Lovelace was that she had a mother who was a champion for education, who back in the 1800s was saying, my girl isn't allowed to go to school, she isn't allowed to go to university, but that's no reason for her not to get an education. So Lady Byron, which was her mum, Isabella, she did whatever she could. She was really rich, so she was able to do this, but she developed an education program for her daughter. And the result was Ada Lovelace and this incredible mind and mathematician and all of that. When I got the first grant to start this work, I asked my friend, whose name is Bilge Denise Aslan, we'll call her Denise, to help me understand the maths. So Bilge is a Turkish refugee. At the time, she was an asylum seeker, and I know our daughters are friends at primary school, and she's a mathematician, and so is her husband. So I didn't understand the maths that Ada Lovelace was talking about, so I said, Denise, would you come and be my maths consultant? Help me understand what this is about and what was she doing and so on. And I'm sorry I'm using both names for her because her name is Lilje, but she gets called Denise in Australia. So I kind of fluctuate between the two, but I'll try and stick with one. So Denise and I, the more we talked and the more we talked about who Ada Lovelace was and what she was able to do and how she learnt that stuff. And then Denise was a maths teacher and mathematician in Turkey. And she started to talk about her experiences of teaching girls and the difficulties that are there for some girls in some parts of Turkey about gaining education and access to information, all that stuff. So actually, that character of Asman came about because I was having lots of conversation with Denise about her experiences of being an educator in a country where education is complex for cultural reasons. So that's where that story started from. So again, it was started from a visual image in that book, but then the whole thing developed because I was having really interesting conversations with Denise and her experiences. So I'm writing the story, but she's the co-creator of the work. So I'm writing the words, but the content is as much hers as it is mine.
Amazing. And it's really about those really fantastic relationships that you build along that way. Sarah, it's really interesting to hear about your approach to storytelling and how you speak so passionately about the works that you're creating as you're creating them. I've only got time for one more question. So what is one of the most standout shows for you in puppetry that you've seen in your career?
Yeah, I thought about this before we met, Pete, because I had a feeling you were going to ask me something like this.
Okay.
So it took a bit of delving to go back and find out what it was called because it's a long time ago. I mean, I've seen many great shows, but one of the ones that really comes to mind is a show that was done by the Minsk Academy of Arts. So we saw this show in 2004, I think, in the Potsdam Festival in Germany. We were there as part of Black Hole's tour of Caravan. Jacob and myself, Kolke Hennenberg and Roddy Primrose were all in that show together. And so it was a whole lot of puppet works, and there was this one piece, and it was called Eternal Song. And what it was they were students from the Minsk Academy of Arts in Belarus. And what was so extraordinary about this work, they performed it all in Russian, so we didn't understand what was being said, but it didn't matter because what they managed to do was communicate the difficulties and the hardships and the struggles of growing up in that part of the world just through the most incredible, beautiful, image-based scenes. So I can give you a really great example. So one of the set pieces was a window box that was filled with rocks. So, usually a window box is filled with herbs or flowers or weeds. If you look out Ada's window and you can see a window box is filled with weeds. But nevertheless, it's usually something greenish, This was a window box filled with big, nasty-looking rocks. And one of the performers comes on, and she's got a big long skirt on and something in her skirt, and she straddles this box, and she pulls out a hammer, and then she pulls out these nails, like 12-inch nails, and on the edge of the nails are these really vivid blue, weird-looking flowers, poppies, but they were blue. Wow. And she starts to pull away the rocks and get the hammer, and she starts hammering this line. She's sewing a bed of metal blue flowers, and it was so disturbing watching a farmer sow inedible food. And what we learnt about later was that you can't eat any of the food that's grown in mints because it's fucking radioactive.
Oh my God.
So the soil is so polluted from years of just the Russians just dumping their rubbish there that it's poisonous. And in this one image, she created this in-your-face, extraordinarily visceral people from, Melbourne, where we're so lucky you can grow tucker in your backyard and you'll be fine. You saw my garlic, Pete?
Yeah, that stuff is braided and looks beautiful.
Yeah, you can grow that in your back garden in Melbourne, but in Minsk, it's poison. And we all had this sort of visceral response to this incredible image that this woman had created with the nails and the flowers and the stones and the hammering. It was just so intense. And I think about that show all the time, the way they managed to overlay text and image so beautifully and so powerfully. And I think it comes down to what they were trying to say. And I think that goes right back to that very first conversation where you asked me why puppets. When you marry your content to the visual image, it's just like unbelievable. It's so powerful. It's so strong. That's why we use puppets, because you can get into people in a way that maybe you can't with just an actor.
The power of visual language.
Well, that's right. We understand that. I mean, we lived half a world away from these people in sunny, safe Melbourne, and we could understand what that image was saying, and it hurt watching that.
It's been so lovely hearing you speak so passionately about your experiences. We are out of time. So thank you so much, Sarah. For
so many words, Pete.
So many words.
I rarely speak words. I'm usually making images.
Well, done very well. So thank you, Sarah. You can find Sarah at Lemony S Puppet Theatre, or one word lowercase, on Instagram, and lemonys.net.au. Thanks for listening with us today, and make sure you hit subscribe for more great puppetry arts and practitioner interviews. I've been Pete Davidson, that puppet guy, and this has been Sarah Kriegler.
Thanks, Pete.
And we'll talk to you guys again soon.
God. What a lot of nonsense.
Oh, it's hard, isn't it? It's hard. Thanks for listening. Now, we want to hear from you. Each episode, we post a series of stories and questions related to our guests. Follow us on Instagram at One Orange Sock Productions, or subscribe to us on YouTube at One Orange Sock. You can also find our episode blog at oneorangesock.com. Our title music is composed by Elizabeth Maniscalco, and our cover art is by Chad Barnier. Without them, this podcast could not be possible. Stay tuned. We'll be back soon with another great episode of Talking Sock.